In the cold, echoing corridors of the McMahon estate, Nanya is little more than a shadow in a red uniform. To Mr. Rolland MccMahon, she isn't a person, she's a tool that shouldn't speak. The story begins not with a bang, but with the suffocating silence of Nanya's daily life, polishing silver until her hands bleed, while Rolland hurls insults that cut deeper than any blade. She stays for the survival of her family back home, but the debt of her dignity has reached its limit. This morning, Rolland's cruelty takes a dark turn as Nanya overhears him orchestrating a land grab that will destroy hundreds of lives. The atmosphere shifts from domestic drudgery to a high-stakes thriller. As she enters the grand ballroom to serve him one last time, she isn't just carrying a tray, she's carrying a choice. In a flash of red, her fist connects with his jaw, shattering the billionaire's pride and the room's silence. Behind her, the cold, calculating eyes of William Smith, the Mafia boss, light up with a rare spark of respect. The war has begun. The sun never truly reached the lower levels of the McMahon estate, but Nanya didn't need the light to know it was 4 in the morning. She woke to the familiar, rhythmic ache in her lower back and the damp chill of her basement quarters. In the silence of the pre-dawn hour, she sat on the edge of her narrow cot and smoothed the wrinkles of her red uniform. The fabric was cheap polyester, a jarring crimson stain against the cold gray stone of the manor, designed specifically so that the staff could be spotted from a distance like flares in a field of snow. To Mr. Rolland MccMahon, the uniform was a boundary, a warning that the woman wearing it was a tool, not a person. Nanya stepped into the service corridor, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished linoleum. This was her world, a world of back staircases, hidden service doors, and the suffocating scent of expensive lemon wax. As she ascended to the main floors, the air changed, becoming thick with the smell of old money and the stagnant weight of a house that held too many secrets. By 5, she was in the grand kitchen, her movements a practiced dance of efficiency. She set the silver trays, polished the crystal that was already spotless, and brewed the specific, overly expensive Kenyan coffee that Rolland demanded every morning. She worked with a quiet, fierce intensity. Every penny she earned was funneled back to her village, paying for the education of her younger sisters and the medicine her father needed. That was the fuel in her engine. For them, she could endure the silence. For them, she could become the ghost Rolland required her to be. The silence of the house was broken at precisely 7 o'clock by the heavy, arrogant tread of Rolland MccMahon's boots. Nanya stood by the sideboard in the breakfast nook, her hands clasped behind her back, her gaze fixed on a point exactly 3 inches above the floor. It was a position she had mastered, the art of being present without being perceived. Rolland entered the room like a storm front. He didn't look at her, but the air seemed to contract in his presence. He was a man built of sharp angles and expensive wool, his face a mask of perpetual dissatisfaction. He sat, snapped open the morning paper, and didn't utter a word of greeting. The only sound was the clink of Nanya's silver spoon against the porcelain as she served his oats. "The temperature is off," Rolland said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. He hadn't even tasted the coffee yet, he simply felt the steam against his cheek. Nanya didn't flinch. "I apologize, sir. I shall bring a fresh pot immediately." "You shall bring it now, and you shall do it without that pathetic look of self-pity on your face," he snapped, finally looking at her. His eyes were cold, filled with a casual cruelty that treated her existence as a personal affront. Nanya felt the familiar heat rise in her chest, a spark of justice that lived deep in her marrow. She lowered her head further, masking the fire in her eyes. "Yes, sir." She retreated to the kitchen, the fresh pot of coffee trembling slightly in her hand. It wasn't fear that made her shake, it was the effort of holding back the tide. She knew the rules of the halls of McMahon. In this house, the walls had ears, the floors had eyes, and the master had no heart. But as she stood by the stove, she caught herself in the reflection of a stainless steel refrigerator. The red of her uniform was vibrant, defiant. She wasn't a ghost, she was a woman waiting for the right moment to scream. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of domestic warfare. She scrubbed floors that were already clean, dusted paintings of Rolland's ancestors, men who looked just as miserable and entitled as he did, and endured the sharp, barked orders that followed her through every room. Rolland spent the afternoon in his study. The heavy oak doors muffled the sounds of his frequent, angry telephone calls. Nanya was tasked with cleaning the hallway outside the study. As she knelt to polish the brass fixtures, the door wasn't fully latched. Through the sliver of space, she heard Rolland's voice, no longer just arrogant, but predatory. "I don't care about the displacement," Rolland hissed into the phone. "The village sits on a vein of lithium that's worth 10 times the lives of the squatters living there. We move in at night, burn the outskirts if you have to. By the time the legal challenges hit the court, the foundations for the refinery will already be poured. They're nobodies, Marcus, inconsequential people, like the help I have scrubbing my floors. They don't have the stomach to fight." Nanya's hand froze on the brass. The inconsequential people he was talking about, she knew them. They were people like her father, people like the neighbors who had shared their last grains of rice when her family was starving. He wasn't just a rude boss, he was a monster planning to erase an entire community for a line on a balance sheet. She felt a presence behind her and nearly gasped. She turned to find a tall, shadow-like figure standing at the end of the corridor. It was William Smith. He was a frequent guest of the MccMahon estate, though he never seemed to enjoy the company. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than Nanya would earn in a decade, but he didn't wear it like Rolland. He wore it like armor. William Smith didn't speak. He didn't demand she return to work. He simply stood there, his dark, impenetrable eyes locked onto hers. He had seen her listening. He had seen the way her knuckles had turned white against the polishing cloth. In his gaze, there was no mockery, no looking down. There was only a cold, calculating curiosity. He looked at her as if he were measuring the strength of her soul. Nanya stood up slowly, smoothing her apron. She didn't look away. For the first time in the halls of MccMahon, she didn't lower her gaze. She saw in William a different kind of power, not the loud, frantic cruelty of Rolland, but the quiet, terrifying weight of a man who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. A loud crash came from inside the study, Rolland throwing a crystal decanter in a fit of rage. "Nanya, get in here and clean this up, you useless girl." Nanya took a breath, the air in the hallway feeling suddenly electric. She looked at William one last time. He gave a microscopic nod, a silent acknowledgement of the war that was brewing behind her eyes. She turned and pushed open the study doors. The room smelled of expensive scotch and raw, unbridled malice. Rolland MccMahon stood behind his desk, his face flushed purple, pointing at the shattered glass on the Persian rug. "Look at this mess," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Just like your life, isn't it? Broken, cheap, and needing someone like me to tell you where to stand." Nanya looked at the glass, then looked up at the man who thought he owned the world. The silence of the halls of MccMahon was still there, but it was no longer the silence of submission. It was the silence before the first strike of lightning. She reached for the brush and pan, her movements slow and deliberate. She would clean the glass today, but the fire she had seen in William Smith's eyes had confirmed what she already knew. The uniform she wore wasn't a shroud, it was a battle flag. The following morning, the MccMahon estate felt like a tomb of marble and glass, quiet but for the distant, rhythmic thumping of Nanya's heart. She moved through the corridors with the same practiced invisibility, but the weight of the conversation she had overheard the previous day sat in her stomach like cold lead. She wasn't just a maid anymore, she was a witness to a crime that hadn't yet been committed, a silent observer of a billionaire's malice. Rolland MccMahon was in a particularly foul mood. He spent the early hours in his private library, a room lined with leather-bound books he never read, used only as a backdrop for the power plays he conducted over the phone. Nanya was tasked with reorganizing the lower shelves, a job that required her to be on her hands and knees for hours. It was a position of submission he clearly enjoyed, occasionally glancing down at her as if she were a piece of stray lint on his expensive rug. "Don't just move the books, Nanya. Align them," he barked, not looking up from his tablet. "Precision is the only thing that separates us from the animals, though in your case, I suppose the line is already blurred." Nanya gripped the edge of a mahogany shelf, her knuckles turning a dusty white. "Yes, Mr. MccMahon." She waited for the click of his heels to fade as he paced the room, waiting for the moment his attention drifted to his digital empire. When he stepped out onto the balcony to take a call, Nanya didn't return to the books. Instead, her eyes darted to the desk, a massive slab of obsidian that sat in the center of the room. On it lay a leather portfolio embossed with the MccMahon crest. Her breath hitched. She knew the risks. In a house like this, curiosity didn't just get you fired, it could get you erased. But she thought of the village, the families whose laughter she could still hear in her dreams, and the fire he planned to light under their lives. With ears strained for the sound of his return, she moved with the grace of a shadow. Her fingers, calloused from years of manual labor, trembled as she flipped open the cover. Inside were blueprints, topographical maps, and a series of legal documents labeled Project Phoenix. As she scanned the pages, the horror of the Wicked King's secret unfolded. It wasn't just a land grab for lithium. The documents revealed that Rolland had bribed local officials to declare the village an ecological hazard zone, a designation that would allow him to bypass all human rights protections. He was planning to use a private security firm, men with no badges and even less conscience, to forcibly remove the inhabitants under the guise of an ecological evacuation. The accidental fires he had mentioned on the phone were part of the protocol to ensure no one would have a home to return to. Most damning of all was a signature page at the back. It was a contract with a notorious shell company known for its ties to international cartels. Rolland wasn't just a greedy billionaire, he was laundering blood money through the destruction of her heritage. A floorboard creaked behind her. Nanya snapped the portfolio shut and dropped to her knees, reaching for a stray book just as the glass doors to the balcony slid open. The air in the room suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. "What are you doing at the desk?" Roland's voice was a low, dangerous purr. Nanya didn't look up immediately. She forced herself to take a slow, steady breath, the kind she used when her mother was sick and there was no medicine. "A pen had fallen, sir. I was retrieving it for you." She stood up, holding out a gold fountain pen she had surreptitiously plucked from the floor. Her face was a mask of perfect, dull obedience. Rolland crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping so close she could smell the expensive tobacco and the scent of a man who believed he was a god. He took the pen, his fingers brushing hers with a deliberate, crushing pressure. He searched her face, his eyes narrowed into slits of suspicion. He was looking for a spark, a hint of intelligence, a sign that the animal had learned a secret. "You're a very quiet girl, Nanya," his voice dropping to a whisper that made the hair on her arms stand up. "But even the quietest things can be stepped on if they get underfoot. Do you understand me?" "I understand my place, sir," she replied, her voice level, though her heart was drumming a war march against her ribs. "Good. Because Project Phoenix is going to change the world. It's going to build a legacy that will last 100 years. People like you, you're just the charcoal we use to fuel the forge." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, a gesture of absolute contempt. Nanya walked out of the library, her legs feeling like water. She didn't head for the kitchen or the basement. She needed air. She slipped out through the service entrance and into the sprawling gardens, where the hedges were trimmed into perfect, unnatural walls. She leaned against a stone fountain, her mind racing. She had the truth, but what could she do with it? She was a maid with no money, no status, and a passport that Rolland kept locked in his safe. She was in a cage, and the tiger was about to strike. A heavy secret for such small shoulders. Nanya jumped, spinning around to find William Smith standing near a row of white roses. He was dressed in a dark gray suit today, looking more like a statue than a man. He hadn't been there a second ago, or perhaps he had simply been part of the shadows. "What do you mean, Mr. Smith?" Nanya reverted to her protective shell. William took a step forward. He didn't look at the house, he looked at her. McMahon is a man who thinks he is a king because he has a crown of gold, but a crown is just a heavy hat if the people decide not to bow. He paused, his gaze drifting to the library windows. He thinks you are a ghost, but ghosts are the only ones who can walk through walls and see what is hidden in the dark. "Why are you telling me this?" Nanya asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and a sudden desperate hope. "Because I despise men who break their own tools," William said, his voice as cold as a winter night, "and because I find myself curious to see what happens when a ghost decides to haunt the king." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small encrypted USB drive, placing it on the edge of the fountain. "The documents in that portfolio have digital backups. If those files were to disappear from his server and appear somewhere else, the king would find himself very alone in his court." Nanya looked at the drive, then back at the Mafia boss. She knew this was a deal with a different kind of devil. William Smith didn't do anything for free. He was a man of shadows, a man whose honor was written in blood. "What do you want in return?" she whispered. William gave a small, chilling smile. "I want to see the look on his face when he realizes that the woman who cleans his floors is the one who took his throne." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the maze of hedges before Nanya could say another word. Nanya looked at the USB drive, then up at the towering, oppressive height of the McMahon mansion. The secret was out. The wicked king was vulnerable, and for the first time in her life, Nanya realized that the red uniform she wore wasn't just a sign of her low position. It was the color of the blood she was willing to spill to save her people. She picked up the drive and tucked it deep into the hidden pocket of her apron. The silence in the halls of McMahon was about to be broken by the sound of a falling empire. Nanya headed back inside, her steps no longer the soft, hesitant taps of a servant, but the steady, purposeful stride of a woman going to war. The evening of the Obsidian Gala arrived with a shimmering, deceptive elegance that made Nanya's skin crawl. The McMahon estate had been transformed into a cathedral of excess, draped in white orchids and lit by 1,000 flickering candles. This was the stage where Rolland planned to finalize the destruction of her village, the night he would sign the papers that would turn 1,000 homes into ash and lithium mines. Nanya's hands were steady as she adjusted her red uniform for the 100th time. The USB drive William Smith had given her was a cold weight against her thigh, tucked into the secret hem she had stitched herself. She was no longer just the help. She was a saboteur in the house of a king. The ballroom was a sea of velvet and diamonds, a swirl of laughter that sounded to Nanya like the clinking of chains. She moved through the crowd with a tray of crystal flutes, her eyes scanning the room. Rolland was at the center of it all, preening like a peacock, his voice booming as he bragged about his visionary new project. Standing in the shadows near the grand entrance was William Smith. He didn't drink and he didn't mingle. He simply watched. When his eyes met Nanya's, there was no nod this time, only a sharp, expectant silence. The moment of the signing was announced with a flourish of trumpets. A small mahogany table was brought to the center of the dance floor, and on it sat the leather portfolio Nanya had seen in the library. Rolland stepped forward, a gold pen in his hand, the same pen Nanya had retrieved for him. Beside him stood Marcus, his legal shark, holding the final contract. "To progress," Rolland announced, raising his glass to the cheering elite, "to a world where the bold take what the weak cannot keep." Nanya felt the air in the room vanish. She saw the document. She saw the signature line that would authorize the private security forces to move in on her people at dawn. Rolland leaned over the table, the gold nib of the pen hovering just millimeters from the parchment. Time didn't just slow down, it fractured. Nanya saw the arrogance in the curve of Rolland's lip. She saw the inconsequential people he had mocked, the faces of her mother, her sisters, and her neighbors flashing before her eyes. The silence she had maintained for months, the place she had been told to keep, shattered within her like falling glass. She didn't think, she reacted with the primal force of a woman who had nothing left to lose but her soul. Nanya dropped her tray. The sound of a dozen crystal flutes shattering against the marble floor rang out like a gunshot, freezing the room in a gasp of horror. Before the first shard had even stopped skittering, Nanya was moving. She didn't run, she lunged. Rolland looked up, his eyes widening in confusion as the invisible girl in red suddenly loomed over him. He opened his mouth to bark an insult, but the word never formed. Nanya's fist, hardened by years of scrubbing floors and carrying the weight of her family, connected with the center of Rolland's jaw with a sickening, wet thud. It wasn't just a punch, it was a decade of suppressed rage, 1,000 swallowed insults, and the desperate cry of a village delivered in one singular physical blow. The billionaire's head snapped back. The gold pen flew from his hand, spinning through the air like a dying spark before clattering into the debris of the broken glass. Rolland crumbled, his knees hitting the marble first before he slid backward, a streak of crimson staining his white silk shirt. For a heartbeat, the silence was absolute. It was a silence that felt as if it were stretching across the entire city, vibrating through the streets of the Bronx and over the oceans to her home. A maid had struck a god. You animal!" Marcus screamed, finally breaking the spell. "Security! Get her! Kill her!" Heavy-set men in black suits swarmed from the perimeter, their hands reaching for their holsters. Nanya stood over the fallen king, her chest heaving, her knuckles split and bleeding. She didn't cower, she didn't run. She looked down at Rolland, who was clutching his face and groaning in the dirt of his own making. "That contract is a death warrant," Nanya's voice rang out, clear and resonant, slicing through the panicked murmurs of the elite. "He is a murderer, and you are all his witnesses." The security guards slammed Nanya to the floor. Her face was pressed against the cold marble, her arms twisted painfully behind her back. Through the forest of legs and the chaos of screaming guests, she saw a pair of polished black shoes stop just inches from her eyes. William Smith stepped out of the shadows. The guards hesitated, their hands hovering over their weapons. William didn't look at them. He looked down at Nanya. Rolland was being helped to his feet, his jaw already beginning to purple and swell, his eyes wild with a murderous, humiliated rage. "I'll have you flayed," Rolland shrieked, his voice high and cracking. "I'll bury you in a hole so deep the sun will forget you exist. Do you hear me? You're dead. You're nothing." William Smith spoke then, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that silenced the room more effectively than the punch had. "She isn't nothing, Rolland. She's the only person in this room who had the courage to tell you the truth." "Stay out of this, Smith," Rolland spat, blood flecking his lips. "This is assault. This is a criminal act."
"It is," William agreed, his eyes never leaving Nanya's. "And a crime demands a trial, a public one, with evidence." Nanya felt the USB drive against her skin. She looked at William, and in that moment she understood the plan. This wasn't the end, it was the opening volley. The punch had ensured that the world was looking. The gala was no longer a celebration, it was a crime scene. "Take her away," Rolland hissed to the police, who were now pouring through the doors. "Lock her in the darkest cell you have. I want her broken by morning." As the officers hauled Nanya to her feet, she didn't struggle. She kept her head high, her red uniform torn, but her spirit soaring. She was being led out in handcuffs, but as she passed through the velvet-lined doors, she saw the mahogany table had been overturned. The contract was unsigned, soaked in the spilled champagne of a dead party. Outside, the city lights felt brighter, more electric. The news of the Maid's punch was already beginning to ripple through the digital world, carried by the phones of 100 shocked socialites. Nanya was being pushed into the back of a police cruiser, but as the door slammed shut, she looked through the tinted glass and saw William Smith standing on the mansion steps. He didn't wave, he didn't smile, he simply adjusted his cufflinks and watched the car drive away. The war had moved from the halls of MccMahon to the eyes of the public, and for the first time in his life, the billionaire was going to find out that money couldn't buy silence once the world had heard the sound of justice hitting home. The holding cell at the 12th precinct was a cold, windowless box that smelled of industrial bleach and old desperation. Nanya sat on the metal bench, her hands still trembling, not from fear, but from the residual electricity of the strike. Her knuckles were swollen, the skin split across her right hand, but the pain felt like a badge of honor. For the first time in her life, the weight in her chest wasn't the burden of poverty, it was the lightness of a truth finally spoken. The hours stretched into a blur of shadows. Officers passed the iron bars with looks of varied curiosity. In their eyes, she saw the same thing she saw in Rolland's. She was a maid who had overstepped her bounds. She was a glitch in the system that needed to be erased. They had taken her belt and her shoes, but they hadn't found the seam in her hem. The USB drive remained pressed against her skin, a digital heart beating with the secrets of a dying empire. "You've got a visitor, girl," a guard grunted, his keys rattling like a death knell against the bars. "And you're lucky, your billionaire boss wants to see you personally before they ship you to Rikers." Nanya stood, her back straight despite the exhaustion. She expected to see Rolland's face, purple with rage and bandaged from her blow. Instead, when the heavy door to the interrogation room swung open, she was met with a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. William Smith sat at the metal table. He looked entirely out of place in the grime of the precinct, his dark suit pristine, his presence turning the cramped room into a seat of power. He wasn't the visitor she was told to expect, yet he was exactly the person she knew would come. He didn't speak as the guard retreated, locking the door behind them. He simply watched her. It was the same gaze from the hallway and the garden, a cold, calculating stare that seemed to peel back the layers of her skin to see the fire beneath. To Rolland, she was a tool. To the police, she was a criminal. But under William Smith's gaze, Nanya felt like a soldier being inspected by her general. "He is moving faster than I anticipated," William said, finally, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in the marrow of her bones. "MccMahon has already filed for a fast-track hearing. He doesn't just want you jailed, he wants the records sealed and your name blackened before the sun sets tomorrow. He wants the world to believe you are a mentally unstable girl who had a violent episode." "I am not unstable. I am the only one who saw what he was doing." In the eyes of the law, those two things are often the same when the person you accuse owns the courthouse, William said. He leaned forward, the light catching the sharp edge of his jaw. "You struck a man who is worth $10 billion. In his world, that is a heresy that demands a public execution. He is going to crush you, Nanya. He will bring the weight of his lawyers, his media contacts, and his bought-off politicians to bear on your neck." Nanya leaned against the table, mirroring his intensity. "Then let him. I have the drive. I have the truth." The truth is a weapon, but a weapon is useless if the person holding it is dead or buried in a cell where no one can hear them. You have started a war, little ghost, but you have no army. He paused, and for a fleeting second, the coldness in his eyes softened into something resembling a grim form of respect. "I have spent my life watching people. Most of them are hollow, filled with greed or fear. But you punched a king to save people who will never even know your name. That is a rare kind of madness, or a rare kind of honor. Why are you here, Mr. Smith? You are his friend. You are at his gala. You are part of his world." William Smith stood up, the chair scraping against the concrete floor with a sound like a sharpening blade. He walked to the small, reinforced window and looked out at the city skyline. Rolland MccMahon is a man of noise. He thinks power is how loud you can bark. I am a man of shadows. I know that true power is who stays standing when the lights go out. I am here because I find I dislike the idea of a woman like you being silenced by a man like him. He turned back to her, and the intensity of his gaze was now focused, sharp, and purposeful. I am going to provide you with a lawyer, not one of the vultures MccMahon has on his payroll, but a man who owes me his life and doesn't fear the fire. But understand this, Nanya. Once I step in, there is no going back. This war will not just be about a punch. It will be about everything he has hidden in the dark. It will be about the blood on his hands and the lithium in your soil. I already decided to fight when I hit him, Nanya said. Then prepare yourself, William said, walking toward the door. The shadow is moving. MccMahon thinks he's the one holding the leash, but he is about to find out that the dog he's been kicking has teeth. He stopped at the door, his hand on the heavy iron handle. He looked back at her one last time, his gaze lingering on her bruised knuckles. Keep the drive safe. Do not give it to anyone but the man I send. And Nanya? Yes? Try not to look so much like a victim. You've already won the first round. A king who bleeds is a king who can be killed. The door slammed shut and the silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the silence of the basement or the hall. It was the silence of an assassin waiting for the mark. Nanya sat back down on the metal bench, her heart thumping a steady, rhythmic beat of war. The Mafia boss had seen her, and in his gaze, she had found the one thing Rolland MccMahon could never buy, an ally who knew exactly how to burn a kingdom to the ground. The morning light that filtered through the high, barred windows of the precinct was gray and unforgiving, offering no warmth to the cold concrete of Nanya's cell. The silence William Smith had left behind was quickly replaced by the cacophony of a system designed to break the spirit. But Nanya did not feel broken. She sat on the edge of her cot, the memory of the punch still thrumming in her right hand like a dormant volcano. By noon, the atmosphere changed. The casual indifference of the guards shifted into a sharp, jagged hostility. Rolland MccMahon's revenge didn't start with a physical blow. It started with the erasure of her humanity. The cell door was thrown open, and instead of a meal tray, she was met by two officers who didn't look her in the eye. They shackled her wrists and ankles with a roughness that was purely performative, meant to remind her of her insignificance. She was led not to a courtroom, but to a small, windowless processing room, where a television was mounted on the wall, flickering with the midday news. "Look at the screen, girl. See what your truth is worth." The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen sent a chill through her that the seller never could. Attacker in MccMahon estate identified, disgruntled employee with history of mental instability. A photo of Nanya, taken years ago for her work permit, appeared next to a glamorous shot of a bandaged, recovering Rolland MccMahon. The reporter's voice was a polished drone, speaking of a violent, unprovoked assault by a maid who had supposedly been obsessed with her employer. They had already interviewed a former coworker, a woman Nanya had never met, who claimed Nanya had a dark temper and delusions of grandeur. Rolland wasn't just suing her, he was rewriting her soul. He was making her a monster so that when he eventually crushed her, the world would cheer. The door opened again, and this time the wicked king himself walked in. Rolland MccMahon looked different. His jaw was wrapped in a surgical brace, and his skin was a sickly shade of yellow and bruised purple. He moved slowly, his usual predatory grace replaced by a stiff, mechanical anger. He signaled for the guards to leave, and for the first time, they obeyed a civilian without question. He stood before Nanya, the scent of expensive antiseptic clashing with the grime of the room. He didn't speak for a long time. He simply stared at her, his eyes burning with a hatred that was almost intimate. "You think you've won something, don't you?" Roland's voice was a distorted hiss through the wires of his brace. "You think because a man like William Smith looked at you, you're suddenly more than the dirt under my heel."
Nanya stood her ground, the chains around her wrists clinking softly. "I saw the contract, Rolland. The world is going to see it too." Rolland laughed, a dry, rasping sound that ended in a wince of pain. "The contract? Which one? The one that burned in the fireplace this morning, or the one my lawyers have replaced it with? A perfectly legal, perfectly boring land development agreement." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. "I am going to freeze your family's bank accounts back home. I've flagged your father's medical records. He won't be getting his next dose of medicine, Nanya. Not today, not ever. Not unless you sign a confession stating that you fabricated those lies to blackmail me." The air in the room became heavy, suffocating. This was the billionaire's revenge. Not a jail cell, but a slow, calculated strangulation of everything she loved. He wasn't just attacking her, he was reaching across the ocean to strike at the people she had punched him to protect. "You're a maid," Rolland whispered, leaning in so close she could see the frantic pulse in his neck. "You're a footnote in a story about my greatness. I will spend every penny of my $10 billion to ensure that by the time this is over, you will wish you had never been born. I will make sure the name Nanya is synonymous with liar and madwoman. Your village will burn, your father will die, and you will rot in a cage watching it happen on a black and white TV." He pulled a single sheet of paper from his jacket and laid it on the table. "A confession. Sign it, and I'll let your father live. Refuse, and you'll be buried in the same soil I'm going to pave over." Nanya looked at the paper, then at the man who thought he could buy the truth. For a second, the weight of his power felt absolute. He owned the news, the police, and the very medicine her father needed to breathe. She felt the tears pricking at her eyes, not of fear, but of the sheer, exhausting unfairness of it all. But then she felt the USB drive. It was still there, hidden in the hem of her uniform, a small, hard secret against her skin. She remembered William Smith's words, "A king who bleeds is a king who can be killed." Nanya looked up at Rolland. She didn't look like a victim. She didn't look like a disgruntled employee. She looked like a woman who had seen the devil and wasn't impressed. "My father taught me one thing before he got sick," Nanya said, her voice low and as sharp as a razor. "He said that a man who has to kill to prove his power is a man who has already lost it. You can burn the village, you can take my life, but you will never, ever be able to unpunch that jaw. Every time you look in the mirror, every time you feel that ache when you eat, you will remember that a nobody in a red uniform broke you." Roland's face contorted, a vein throbbing in his temple. He raised his hand as if to strike her, but his own pain stopped him. He was a coward who used others to do his bleeding for him. "You'll regret that," he hissed, snatching the confession back. "By tonight, you'll be in a high-security transport. Accidents happen on the road to Rikers, Nanya, especially to unstable girls who try to escape." He turned and stormed out, the heavy door slamming behind him with a finality that echoed through the entire precinct. Nanya was left in the dim light of the processing room. She was alone, shackled, and marked for death. The billionaire's revenge had begun, and it was more terrifying than she had imagined. But as she was led back to her cell, she saw a man standing by the precinct desk. He was a tall, silver-haired man in a suit that looked like it belonged in a boardroom, not a jail. He was holding a briefcase, and he was looking straight at her. He wasn't William Smith, but he had the same shadow in his eyes. He gave her a single, sharp nod as she passed. The transport might be coming, and the accidents might be planned, but the war wasn't over. Rolland MccMahon had used his money to buy the world's perception, but he had forgotten that some secrets are too loud to be buried, and some maids are too brave to stay behind bars. Nanya sat back down in her cell, her swollen knuckles resting on her lap, waiting for the shadow to move. The fluorescent lights of the New York County Courthouse hummed with a clinical, predatory energy. Nanya sat at the defense table, her small frame swallowed by the high-backed wooden chair. She still wore her red maid's uniform. It was the only clothing she had when they arrested her, but it had been washed and pressed by the silver-haired man William Smith had sent, a lawyer named Elias Thorne. Thorne sat beside her, his fingers interlaced over a leather briefcase that held the digital explosive Nanya had carried in her hem for days. The courtroom was packed with the elite, a sea of silk and expensive cologne. Rolland MccMahon sat at the prosecution table, his jaw still braced, his eyes fixed on Nanya, with a gaze that promised total annihilation. He had turned the trial into a media circus, a stand for the safety of the wealthy against the unhinged. To the public watching the cameras at the back of the room, Nanya was a dangerous anomaly. To Rolland, he was a bug he was about to crush under the heel of the law. The proceedings began not with a discussion of the contract or the village, but with a systematic assassination of Nanya's character. Roland's lead attorney, a man whose smile looked like it had been bought at a jewelry store, paced the floor with theatrical indignation. This is not a case about labor rights. This is a case about a violent, premeditated assault on one of this city's greatest philanthropists. Nanya is a woman who abused the trust of her employer, a woman who, according to psychiatric experts, suffers from deep-seated resentment of the successful. She didn't just punch Mr. MccMahon, she tried to strike at the very fabric of our society. Nanya watched as witnesses were called. A former supervisor from the cleaning agency lied under oath, claiming Nanya had stolen jewelry. A medical expert testified that her behavior at the gala was consistent with a psychotic break. With every lie, the room grew colder. The judge, a man who had shared many dinners at the MccMahon estate, looked at Nanya with a mixture of pity and disgust.
When it was Nanya's turn to speak, the room went silent. Elias Thorne stood up, his voice calm and sharp as a scalpel. The prosecution has painted a picture of a madwoman, but they haven't explained why a madwoman would risk everything to stop a single signature. Nanya, tell the court what you saw in the library. Nanya stood. Her voice trembled for a second before the memory of her father's face steadied her. I saw a map, she said, looking directly at the judge. I saw a plan to burn a village for lithium. I saw a contract that turned human lives into line items on a budget. I didn't punch a philanthropist. I punched a man who was about to order a massacre. Laughter rippled through the gallery, a cruel, mocking sound. Rolland smirked, leaning back in his chair. And where is this contract, Nanya? Rolland's lawyer sneered. We've searched the estate. We've searched your quarters. There is no such document. It is the delusion of a girl who spends too much time in the shadows. The physical contract was destroyed, Elias Thorne interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. But the digital fingerprints of a crime are much harder to burn. Thorne opened his briefcase and pulled out the USB drive. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at the man standing in the very back of the courtroom, shrouded in the shadows of the doorway. William Smith was there, his arms crossed, his gaze a silent command to proceed. Your Honor, Thorne said, this drive contains the encrypted backups of Rolland MccMahon's private server. It contains the correspondence with the illegal security firms, the bribe receipts for the African officials, and the original Project Phoenix blueprints. It was recovered by my client at the risk of her life. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The mocking whispers died. Rolland's smirk vanished, replaced by a gray, sickly pallor. He lunged toward his lawyer, whispering frantically, his composure shattering like the crystal flutes at the gala. This is inadmissible, the prosecution yelled, their voices rising in panic. This was stolen. This is a violation of privacy. It is evidence of a conspiracy to commit mass murder, Thorne countered, stepping toward the bench. And in this state, the necessity defense applies. My client committed a simple assault to prevent a catastrophic felony. The punch wasn't an act of madness. It was the only way to stop the clock. The judge looked at the drive, then at Rolland, whose frantic eyes were now darting toward the exits. But the exits were no longer clear. Two men in dark suits, William Smith's men, stood by the doors, their presence a silent wall.
Nanya felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. She looked at the giant sitting across from her. Rolland MccMahon was no longer the wicked king. He was a man trapped in a cage of his own greed. The Maid's war had moved from the kitchen to the courtroom, and for the first time, the giant was the one who looked small. "Your Honor," Nanya said, her voice now loud enough to reach the back of the room. "He told me I was inconsequential. He told me that people like me don't have the stomach to fight. But the truth doesn't care about my position. It only cares that it's told." The judge hammered his gavel to restore order as the courtroom erupted into chaos. Journalists scrambled for their phones, and the elite began to distance themselves from Rolland as if he were suddenly radioactive. Nanya sat back down, her heart racing. The war wasn't over. The legal battle for the drive's admissibility would be a bloodbath, but the silence had been broken forever. As the court went into a frantic recess, Nanya looked back at the shadow in the corner. William Smith gave her a single, slow nod before disappearing into the hallway. The giant had been hit. Now the world was going to watch him fall. The recess was a whirlwind of frantic legal motions and hushed, panicked whispers. But inside the small witness waiting room, the air was unnervingly still. Nanya sat alone, her hands folded in her lap, watching the dust motes dance in a single shaft of light. The chaos of the courtroom felt miles away until the heavy oak door clicked open. She expected Elias Thorne with a stack of papers. Instead, the room seemed to darken as William Smith stepped inside. He didn't sit. He stood by the window, his presence commanding the space with a gravity that made the institutional walls feel flimsy. For a long moment, he didn't speak, his silhouette a sharp, dark line against the afternoon sun. "MccMahon is making his move," William said, his voice a low, melodic threat. "He's not just fighting the admissibility of the drive. He's reaching out to the digital forensics team at the precinct. By the time the judge reconvenes, the chain of custody will be questioned. He's going to claim the files were planted by a third party, an underworld element, to frame a legitimate businessman." Nanya looked up, her brow furrowing. But the files are real. The truth doesn't change just because of who holds the light. In this building, the truth is a clay figure, and MccMahon has the hands of a sculptor. He has already funneled a six-figure donation to the lead forensic technician's offshore account. By 4 o'clock, the report will say the USB drive contains corrupted data and traces of state-sponsored malware. Nanya felt the familiar cold seep back into her bones. The giant wasn't just falling, he was tearing down the pillars of the temple to stay upright. "Then we've lost. The evidence is everything." "No," William said, taking a step toward her. His eyes were no longer just calculating, they were predatory. "Evidence is what you show a judge. Leverage is what you show a man. I told you I do not like men who break their own tools. But more than that, I do not like men who think they are more powerful than the shadows that allow them to exist." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. He laid it on the table in front of Nanya. It wasn't a contract or a map. It was a photograph, grainy, black and white, taken from a high angle. It showed Rolland MccMahon standing on a private pier, handing a briefcase to a man whose face was obscured by a hood. "The lithium wasn't for his company, Nanya," William whispered. "He was brokering a side deal with a sanctioned regime. He wasn't just stealing your land, he was committing treason against the very country that gave him his tax breaks. The USB drive has the blueprints, but this photograph, this is the key to a door he can never close." "Where did you get this?" Nanya asked, her voice a mere breath. "I have spent 20 years being the man people like Rolland come to when they want to hide their sins," William said, a chillingly calm smile touching his lips. "I kept receipts. I was content to let him play his games as long as he stayed within the lines of a certain kind of honor. But he crossed that line when he threatened your father's life." The door burst open, and Elias Thorne stepped in, looking ashen. "They've suppressed the drive, Your Honor. The judge ruled it inadmissible due to potential tampering. We have 10 minutes before they move for a directed verdict of guilt on the assault charge." Nanya looked at the photograph, then at William. The Mafia boss gave her a microscopic nod, the silent guardian's final instruction. "Mr. Thorne," Nanya said, her voice rising with a newfound, terrifying clarity. "We don't need the drive anymore. We need to invite the federal prosecutor into the room." As they walked back into the courtroom, the atmosphere was jubilant on the prosecution side. Rolland was leaning back, whispering to his lawyer, a smug, twisted grin visible even through his medical brace. He looked at Nanya as she took her seat, his eyes mocking her, mouthing the word "nothing" once more. The judge cleared his throat, raising his gavel. "Your Honor, if I may," Elias Thorne interrupted, his voice cutting through the room like a guillotine. "New evidence has come to light, not digital, physical, and it involves a matter of national security that supersedes this court's jurisdiction." Nanya watched Roland's face. She watched the way his smugness didn't just fade, it curdled. As Thorne walked the photograph to the bench, the room fell into a silence so heavy as if the oxygen had been sucked out. From the back of the room, William Smith didn't move. He stood in his usual corner, his arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't part of the legal team, he wasn't a witness, he was the architect of the collapse. He had stepped out of the shadows just enough to tilt the world, and now he was watching the gravity take hold. The judge looked at the photograph. He looked at the federal seal William had surreptitiously attached to the back of the filing. He looked at Rolland, who was now clutching the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were turning purple. "Mr. MccMahon," the judge said, his voice trembling with a sudden, sharp fear, "I suggest you remain in your seat. Bailiff, secure the doors. No one leaves this room." The silent guardian had intervened. He hadn't used a gun or a bribe in the courtroom. He had simply revealed the truth that the billionaire was too arrogant to realize was being recorded. Nanya sat back, her heart beating a steady, victorious rhythm. She looked at William one last time. He didn't smile. He simply adjusted the set of his shoulders and turned to leave. He had protected his tool, and in doing so, he had ensured that the Maid's war was no longer a struggle for survival. It was an execution of justice. The giant wasn't just falling, he was being erased. And as the federal agents began to filter into the room, Nanya realized that the shadow in the corner had given her the greatest gift of all, the power to watch her enemy realize that he was truly inconsequential. The courtroom, once a theater for Rolland MccMahon's staged perfection, had become a chamber of his slow, agonizing undoing. The silence that followed the presentation of William Smith's autograph was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, airless vacuum that precedes a building's collapse. Rolland sat frozen, his fingers digging so deeply into the mahogany table that his knuckles turned a ghostly white. The medical brace on his jaw, once a prop for sympathy, now looked like a muzzle, trapping the lies he could no longer voice.
The federal prosecutor, a woman with eyes like flint who had been waiting in the gallery, stepped forward as the judge signaled her. The atmosphere in the room shifted from a local assault case to a national security crisis. Nanya watched as the giant began to shrink in real time. The arrogance that had defined Roland's posture for months evaporated, replaced by a frantic, animalistic desperation. He looked toward his team of high-priced lawyers, but they were already leaning away from him, their pens still, their faces carefully blank. They were sharks, and they had smelled the blood of their own client. "Mr. MccMahon," the judge's voice was no longer deferential. It was cold, carrying the weight of a final sentence. "In light of this evidence, which suggests not only a conspiracy to defraud, but active treasonous brokering with a sanctioned entity, this court is staying the current proceedings. You are to be remanded into federal custody effective immediately." The sound of the gavel hitting the bench was like a thunderclap, signaling the end of an era. Federal agents moved in, their boots heavy on the marble floor. They didn't treat Rolland with the gentle care the local police had shown. They hauled him up from his chair, his expensive wool jacket bunching at the shoulders as they wrenched his arms behind his back. The metal of the handcuffs ratcheted shut, a sharp, mechanical sound that echoed the snapping of his empire. "You can't do this," Rolland shrieked, his voice breaking into a high, pathetic pitch.
He turned his head wildly, searching the room until his eyes landed on Nanya. This is her fault, a maid. You're taking the word of a servant over mine? She's a ghost. She's nothing. Nanya stood up slowly. She didn't shout back. She didn't need to. She simply watched him, her expression one of calm, weary justice. The ghost is the only one left in the room, Rolland, and unlike you, I have a name. As the agents dragged him toward the side exit, Roland's composure completely disintegrated. He kicked and thrashed, his polished shoes scuffing the floor he had once walked with such entitlement. He was no longer the billionaire boss. He was a common criminal being removed from the light. The wicked king was being led to a dungeon of his own making, and as the heavy doors closed behind him, the suffocating pressure that had hung over Nanya's life for months finally lifted. The unmasking continued outside the courtroom walls. Within hours, news of the Phoenix treason broke across every major network. The media, which Rolland had manipulated into painting Nanya as a madwoman, pivoted with dizzying speed. The narrative of the unstable maid was replaced by the heroic whistleblower. The secondary files on the USB drive, the ones the judge had initially suppressed, were leaked to the press by an anonymous source in the shadows, revealing the full extent of the lithium conspiracy. The outcry from the public was a tidal wave. Protests erupted in front of MccMahon Tower, not just for Nanya, but for the village halfway across the world that he had planned to erase. The inconsequential people Rolland had mocked had found their voice through the strike of a single hand. Back in the quiet of the attorney-client room, Elias Thorne began packing his briefcase. He looked at Nanya, a rare, genuine smile softening his features. The federal government has frozen all his assets, Nanya, not just his personal accounts, but the corporate holdings. The project in your village has been permanently halted by executive order, and your father, William Smith, has already seen to it. He was moved to a private facility in Switzerland this morning. He's receiving the best care in the world. Nanya felt a sob catch in her throat, not of grief, but of overwhelming relief. The debt was paid. The village was safe. Her father would breathe again. She walked out of the courthouse steps where a swarm of cameras and reporters waited. They shouted her name, desperate for a quote, a tear, a sign of her triumph. But Nanya didn't stop for them. She looked across the street where a black sedan sat idling at the curb. The window rolled down just an inch, revealing the cold, dark eyes of William Smith. He didn't get out to join the celebration. He didn't claim credit for the fall of the giant. He simply watched her, ensuring her path was clear, a silent guardian who had seen a maid declare war and win. He had given her the sword, but she had been the one with the heart to swing it. Nanya took a deep breath of the New York air. It no longer smelled of lemon wax and expensive tobacco. It smelled of rain and possibility. The uniform she wore, the red cloth that was supposed to mark her as a servant, now felt like a royal robe. She had been the nothing that toppled a kingdom, and as she stepped away from the courthouse and toward her new life, she knew that the halls of MccMahon would never be silent again. The menace was gone, and in his place stood a woman who had proven that justice doesn't care about the size of your bank account, it only cares about the strength of your strike. The transformation of her life was mirrored by the news reports that still dominated the airwaves. Rolland MccMahon's empire had been systematically dismantled. His assets were being liquidated to pay for the environmental restoration of the lands he had tried to steal and to provide reparations for the families he had threatened. The Project Phoenix was dead, and in its place, a foundation had been established to protect the rights of domestic workers and indigenous communities, a foundation that Nanya had been asked to lead. But the greatest victory wasn't in the headlines. It was in the quiet moments. 2 weeks after the trial, Nanya stepped off a plane in her home village. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and blooming jasmine, exactly as she remembered. She wasn't met by private security or burning outskirts, but by a wall of song. Her father, looking stronger than he had in years thanks to the treatment William Smith had secured, stood at the front of the crowd. He didn't see a maid, he saw the daughter who had fought a giant and won. Nanya spent her days working with the community, ensuring the lithium remained in the ground and the people remained in their homes. She was no longer an invisible girl in a distant city. She was a leader, a protector, and a symbol of what happens when the inconsequential refuse to stay quiet. On her final evening in the village before returning to New York to begin her work with the foundation, a familiar black sedan appeared on the dusty road. It looked entirely out of place against the vibrant greens of the landscape. Nanya walked toward it as the back window slid down. William Smith looked out at her, his expression as unreadable as ever. But as he looked at Nanya, standing tall in the light of the setting sun, there was no denying the shift in their dynamic. They were no longer the master's guest and the master's maid. They were two people who had stood in the dark and chosen to let the truth burn. "The board of the new foundation has been finalized," William said, his voice a low, steady anchor. "They are waiting for your signature on the bylaws. They want to ensure no one like MccMahon can ever buy a silence like yours again." Nanya leaned against the car door, looking at the man who had been her silent guardian. "Why did you really help me, William? It wasn't just because you disliked him." William looked toward the horizon, where the sun was dipping below the trees. "I have spent my life in the shadows, Nanya. I have seen the worst of what men do when they think no one is watching. I helped you because, for the first time in 20 years, I saw someone who didn't care who was watching. You didn't punch him because you wanted his money. You punched him because it was right. I find that refreshing." He handed her a small velvet box. Inside was a brooch, a simple, elegant phoenix made of silver and rubies. "A new reign deserves a new crest," he said. "I'm not a queen," Nanya replied, pinning the brooch to her dress. "No," William agreed, a rare, genuine spark of warmth appearing in his eyes. "You're something much more dangerous. You're a woman who knows she's free." The car drove away, disappearing into the twilight, leaving Nanya alone on the path. She looked back at her village, then up at the stars. The maid's war was over, but Nanya's reign was just beginning. She was no longer defined by a uniform, a position, or the whims of a billionaire. She was defined by her choices, her courage, and the ironclad belief that even the smallest voice can topple a kingdom if it speaks the truth. As she walked back toward her father's house, her steps were light and purposeful. The silence of her past was gone, replaced by a symphony of hope. Nanya had stepped beyond the uniform, and in doing so, she had changed the world. After the rain, the sky had finally cleared, and the miracle she had fought for was finally home.
Hey family, thank you for the constant love and support on this channel. Every like, share, comment, and subscription truly means everything to me and helps this community keep growing. If you're enjoying these stories, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Also, drop your name and where you're watching from in the comments. I'll be giving personal shoutouts and thanking you directly in my next post. I appreciate every single one of you.